the first thing we want to do before we get into our conversation is to let you hear from a woman who is also in our audience today. Her name is Mary Jane Reddington. She's a graduate of the College of New Rochelle, class of 45, and she has been a lifelong resident of New Rochelle. She was a middle school English teacher on the board of directors of the CNR Alumni Association. She has served as an elected member of the New Rochelle Board of Education for 30 years. And she's the president of the New Rochelle Women's Club for 25 years. And so we talked to her a little bit, and we wanted to show some tape to you from the interview about the experience of voting and what it means to her.
I first voted in 1944. We had to be 21 years old then. I never missed a vote, and I never will, no matter how difficult it might be at this point with the pandemic. What impressed me was in 1983, that was the first time that we had a voted school board. And this is something that impressed me more than any other process, was the fact that each vote is so terribly important. It means a great deal. At that point, and this was a lot because they're not voting today, there were more votes than any other since 8,000 votes. And I won by 47. Don't miss a vote. Vote because it is extremely important. I will say that no matter how I vote, whether it's absentee or being present, it is my voice, and I will not miss that opportunity.
Don't miss a vote. That is an important line from that interview to remember. Don't miss a vote. Thank you so much, Mary Jane, for doing that. We want to get into our conversation, but first we're going to do a very quick snap poll to get to know all of you who are watching a little bit. So here is the question of a poll we want to ask you. It is, have you voted in every presidential election that you were eligible to vote in? So very quickly, just give us a wow. Don't forget to vote. See? Mary Jane, they're doing you proud. Yes, yes, yes. No no's, really. No one has not voted in a presidential election that they were eligible to vote in. That's phenomenal. I'm going to give this just one more minute, but I think we know our audience. I think our audience is simpatico with all of our panelists. Okay, so that's it. 100% of you have voted in every presidential you were eligible to vote in, and congratulations. We are proud of you, and we hope that you will continue that trend this November. And we're going to get to that in a minute, but I want to start in the past, and I want to do what I failed to do before, which is to introduce once again our two professors. Maureen McLeod received her PhD in history from Florida State University and joined Mercy College in 2015, where she is currently an assistant professor of history and the program director of history. Dana Horton is with us. Dr. Horton is an assistant professor of English at Mercy College. She received her PhD in English at Northeastern University and her BA in English and African American Studies at Temple University. So thanks to both of you. And before we go forward, I want to go back. And Maureen, I'll just start with you. Can you talk about how seismic an event it was when women got the right to vote?
Well, it obviously was a huge event in 1920 when finally the women in the United States got the right to vote. But it didn't start in 1920. It started much before that. And in the West, for example, the Western United States, women were voting in presidential elections beginning in 1869 in Wyoming. So it's not something that just happened overnight. We know that the desire for women to vote, the suffrage movement, starts back in the 1840s. 1848 is the big movement where we see that happening at the beginning of the women's suffrage movement. But I think it's really important to note that states in the West felt that women needed to vote to bring calm and structure and, peace to this wild Western frontier. Yet the eastern parts of the United States, where we all live, most of us live today, didn't feel that women were needed for that. So it took a long time to get the eastern seaboard really on board, almost 60 years. And I think that's pretty significant. So when women got the right to vote, it was such an important event. And it follows on the heels of Great Britain granting women the right to vote in 1919, and then the United States being next. So it's a really significant movement. And it was accomplished over a long period of time.
So Dana, I want to put up, this is my favorite. I don't know if you all are readers of the New York Times, but they did a whole special section, how American women got the right to vote. And my favorite part in this, and I don't know if how well you'll be able to see this, but it says, women weren't given the right to vote. They won it. They won it. Dana, can you talk about that a little bit? And also, they did win the right to vote, but not everybody won the right to vote.
Yeah, so I'll back up a little bit and start with 1865, basically the Emancipation Proclamation that eradicated slavery in the United States. So part of that period afterwards was Reconstruction, and part of the goal of Reconstruction was to get African Americans reacclimated into American society. Wasn't a huge success, but one of the ways to help African Americans gain citizenship was through the right to vote. So, although that was part of the whole issue of Reconstruction, it still didn't happen on a larger scale. So that's part of the reason why African American women essentially weren't given the opportunity to vote around that time as well. So. Yeah, despite all of these efforts that happened throughout the United States to help get African Americans and Black women acclimated into American society and help them become citizens, there were still so much legislation and so many different laws that were passed that really went against that. Going based on polling tax, grandfather clause, all of these other issues made it extremely hard for women and for African Americans to gain the right to vote and to exercise their right to vote.
And not just African Americans, right? Native Americans, mm-hmm. Asian Americans, right? I mean, there were whole groups of ethnicities who did not enjoy this initially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, any immigrant was going to be struggling with the right to vote, even if they had been in the country for a long time.
Yeah, and a right to vote is so completely tied to citizenship, to autonomy. So if you don't have that, you're essentially not a citizen. You can't participate.
Exactly.
One of the things I read in that takeout on women and the centennial celebration was that the word suffragette was actually like a put down. Mm-hmm.
Well,
is that right?
It's just like the word feminist in a lot of ways, right? I mean, we pride ourselves, I call myself a feminist, but it's been a dirty word for a very long time to be considered a feminist. So, I mean, it's no different than what suffragette was at that point in time. You were going out of the norm, being a radical. Anything that was outside of the accepted norm for a woman to raise a family, be a mother and a good wife made you a radical and unwanted. Dana, I don't know if you want to add to that about the dirty words.
Yeah, it's essentially a form of shaming. It's a form of, we want you to fit into this particular box. And if you don't fit into that box, then we're basically going to beat that out of you until you do. So absolutely, yeah, it's definitely a form of shaming. It's an insult, unfortunately.
Christina, let me bring you into this conversation too. Is this a meaningful centennial celebration, do you think, for
Oh,
all of us?
of course, and especially at this time in our country, I think it's fabulous that so many women have run for office and were elected in 2018. And we have first time we have a woman on a major candidate on the for vice president. So it's kind of everything is just perfect storm right now in a good way, a good storm.
I was also doing some research on this, and one article said it took a surprisingly long time for women to become the electoral force that had been predicted. They were not broadly mobilized, and of course, as you've mentioned, many women of color, immigrants, face barriers to voting, and so there wasn't an observable women's vote that was determinative in elections, that was independent of the men for a really long time. Like, I think they said 1980 was the first time that women voted in an observable amount, sort of equal to men, and it was the first time people talked about a gender gap.
Well, I don't necessarily agree that the idea of having women being a power in physical voting doesn't make it apparent that women were having an influence. And I think that that's what's really important here, is that women were having an influence long before their votes were independent of men, even in the household. The people who were going for election were trying to appeal to women. This is why we see so many different social issues now become a part of the ticket and a part of the platform over the course from women's suffrage and in the end of the progressive era through today. I mean, these are issues that would never have been addressed previously because they're courting the votes of women who historically have always been in charge of the home, of religion, of the domestic realm. Granted, now, thank goodness, we are outside of only those areas. We have voices in other areas as well. But those are the social issues that now become, in post-1920, a part of major tickets because women are voting. And while they're mainly voting with their husbands and their male counterparts who are in their household initially, although there are women who don't, they are bringing up issues that they view are important. And if they have to do anything with childbearing in the home and religion, that's women's area. Men don't touch that area. And that's a historic thing. If you go back to other countries during the American and the French Revolution, the founding fathers and the French revolutionaries never touched those areas because that's the women's realm. So as they bring it up in the position of using their power to vote for it, electors are now making it an issue.
And so in other words, as the women's issues become political issues.
Yes.
We have a chart that I'm hoping we can put up that sort of tracks the percentage of women who vote versus the percentage of men who vote, and the number who reported voting, I should say. The purple is women, and the green, so more women than men voted since 1964. Is that how, am I interpreting that correctly?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And so they've always, so I guess since the election just after John Kennedy.
Yeah, it would have been the second election of his reelection, Kennedy's reelection.
Yes, yes. So what do you make of that, by the way?
I was going to say, I think just to piggyback a lot of what Maureen was saying, it does have to do with how many of the issues that became political are issues that are considered women's issues. Like if we think about the school board, for example, a lot of those issues with regards to how the school board is run, what particular policies are in place, who's on those committees, all of that affects, a lot of that is considered like things that women, their arena, like things that they're supposed to be interested in. So the more that those issues become political, the more of which women are, the more of which women are seizing their right to vote.
We have to remember the 70s and the women's movement. So more women were becoming financially independent, and you didn't have to get married right after college. And people were in the workforce, they're more highly educated in many instances. So I think that would have a great impact on voting.
Education has a huge impact on voting, and I think that's a really good point, Christina, of how important that is. But you also have to remember that, you know, the second wave feminism that's coming about in the 60s and the 70s is really changing the way that women are looking at themselves and what they can do with their lives, and they're becoming more assertive, which is very important.
I don't hear very much about how women vote in greater numbers than men, and I just wonder what you think about. Do you think that after 1920 men became less inclined to vote?
I don't think so. I think men are not less inclined to vote. Women are actually more of the population, if you think about it. So that's something to kind of take into account. But anybody knows that once you are granted, you know, this right, that I think women take it a little bit more seriously. Not to say that men don't take it seriously. I'm not saying that at all. But I think that women are definitely along the lines of, you know, realizing what they can do with their vote. And I think that as we see things pushed back, women's issues have been constantly at the forefront since the time of suffrage. Women, you know, rally. Women are able to gather together and rally for causes that are very important. And as we see disenfranchisement, attempts to disenfranchise women from different rights, women tend to, you know, want to speak more, and the way they can do that is through with their vote.
And by the way, Christina, hold that thought for, they were able to go to distinguished institutions like the College of New Rochelle. I knew you were going to say that. And I'm just going to pick up on a thread from the chat room here. Thanks to women's institutions like CNR, women have moved into the workforce. And now with COVID, we see the new role for women as breadwinners and the impact on the economy with families needing two incomes to survive. So yes, Christina, let me then go to you on that.
Well, I was thinking it's also hard to know how the access to vote or the ability to register, you know, we're talking about 1920, 1930. I mean, I don't know this, you know, the economics, and there was a statistic about how sometimes Black women are let under-registered because of the qualifications of voter ID. Now you have, if you get married, you have to change your name, you have to get a new ID. If you get divorced, you might go back to your maiden name, you might remarry. And all that is money. And sometimes that doesn't seem like that's important at that point. But now, you know, luckily things are so much, well, you know, in most states, I can't talk for the whole country, but more easily to vote. You can register online. You know, we have all this early voting and absentee. This year there'll be most states, or a lot of states are giving absentee ballots or mail-in ballots, as they're being called. To California, for example, everybody in the state is getting a mail-in ballot.
I was going to say, with regards to the education and the head of households points, so particularly a lot of my research focuses on issues related to Black women, and historically and even now, a lot of Black women are heads of households at much larger rates than other races of women. So because of that, they also tend to have higher rates of voting, and as well, they tend to have higher rates of voting than Black women. Than Black men, excuse me. So yeah, and also with regards to the point about women in education, women are also gaining degrees at higher rates as well than men, and there is a correlation between the degree you have, and your voter participation. So that's also one reason why women have increased, or women have voted more than men as well. So.
And I think to pick up on something that was said before, and I'd love to hear what Dana has to say too about this, is this idea of Black women being left out of the suffrage movement by white women. Because I had a student who did a senior thesis on this topic a couple of years ago, and it was fascinating. And then actually there was a really great article in the New York Times, which I'm putting in the chat, in 2018 about how Black women were left out of the suffrage movement. And I mean, I know I have my thoughts on it, but I'd really like to hear, because Dana, with her African-American studies background, what she thinks about it, because I think it's a really fascinating interpretation of the suffrage movement.
Yeah, I think a lot of that has to deal with many of the white women who were at the forefront of the suffrage movement saw women as white. So because of that, they essentially neglected a lot of the needs that Black women had. And also some of the needs of Black women do differ a little bit from what the needs were of white women, and that wasn't really acknowledged. I know that Angela Davis wrote a really great book about this on Women, Race, and Class, where she discusses the history of the feminist movement and the suffrage movement in ways in which it neglected a lot of Black women's needs. Hazel Carby also wrote a really great book, Reconstructing Womanhood, that focuses on a lot of this as well. But most of it has to deal with this issue of intersectionality. So if we're seeing women and correlating that to white, then essentially it's white women's issues that are being centered and Black women's issues are being placed in the background. And that's also why womanism became a lot more popular on the term that Alice Walker helped to popularize. That's why that particular division of feminism became more prominent, because Black women felt as if they needed a space in the movement where their issues could be heard and that they could be centered, since feminism wasn't being attuned to their needs.
Well, I also heard a very disturbing thing that came up recently about Carrie Chapman Catt, who was one of the founders of the League. And she had written to a senator, I believe in South Carolina, and it was a deal that we're not going to let Black women in so that white women will be guaranteed to vote. And that was like, here's someone I looked up to, and suddenly, it was a bargain. And who are we going to, who are we going to throw off the boat so we get the vote? So it was very upsetting at this point.
Yeah, and that goes into a larger conversation about women just not uniting with each other. And we still even see that now. That's part of why Hillary Clinton lost, is we see that particular issue. But it just has to do with women identifying more with their race than even identifying more with their gender. And we still see that as an issue right now.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because I still just feel that's like such an issue, and women sometimes we're our own worst enemy here. And I always look back at the fact that we had to wait for men to give us the right to vote, and yet we can't seem to create a united front. I mean, if you look at how many women are voting, just by sheer numbers, right? Like if we all voted as even like a partial block, it would be, that women would be determining the outcome of a majority of elections. Probably a lot of local elections, which I will say I feel like we don't get enough voter turnout for in general, which is very important, probably more important than anybody realizes. But I think that this is something that, we need to work on as a society in general. I mean, we're seeing all this divisiveness and problems, with cultural and racial inequity. I think that this is something, if we could come together, not just as women, but cross racial boundaries, that this would be something we could fix rather than fighting and arguing amongst ourselves. And I think that's very important.
So we've come so far, but not nearly far enough. There's a question, and actually on that very point in our in the chat room, about young women and as a voting bloc. And it's been a concern about the disenfranchisement of youth in recent years in exercising their right to vote. As a higher ed institution, this is a question I'm thinking goes to our professors. What can we say to our young voters who might be tuning out of the political process to inspire their participation in voting?
Well, one answer I have for that is sometimes it's difficult for younger people to vote, especially if, for example, they're going to college in one place and their hometown is another place. So that becomes an issue of like, where do you register? So even like the process for registering is not always transparent and clear for them. So I would say like that's one issue as well that might keep young people from voting. And I would think making that process more transparent and making it much easier for them to even register the vote would help to mitigate some of that.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I ran in 2016 a voting drive on campus, and we registered a significant amount of people to vote. The League of Women Voters was with us on this for the History Club, and it was really successful. But I mean, we speak about voting in my classes, even if the class is not about that, because it's an important thing. And I get a lot of times questions about, why does it matter? My vote doesn't actually count. That's when I get, especially regarding presidential elections with the Electoral College, and we talk about the relevance and what it is and everything. And I think that this idea that I think we have to get past with the younger people in voting is that it matters. Their vote does count. We have to show them how it counts. And I don't think they can see that just yet. They will eventually, but we need to be having them see it at 18, 19, and 20.
Right, hopefully not when they're our age, by the way. Or my age, at any rate.
So
I want to
important.
bring our commissioners into this conversation. Let's just start on this very specifically. Dorothy DiPaolo, who is the Republican Deputy Commissioner, and Reginald Lafayette, who is the Democratic Commissioner. Dorothy, I'll start with you, because you're a woman, and we're talking about women's voting. What do you make of this issue of young people feeling disenfranchised and sort of not feeling like they have a stake in any of this?
I haven't come across that here.
Yeah.
We have a lot of young people, they can't wait to vote. And we get their applications early, as a matter of fact, and they are turned over as soon as they turn 18. So we don't really see that much here.
Some of them registered at 17.
Yeah, a lot of them register at 17. And
Really?
really, they keep on emailing us and everything. When are they allowed to vote? And we tell them as soon as their birthday comes along, they're registered. So we don't see that here.
Yeah, I'm going to try to steer clear of politics and stay on women. So let me ask you both this question. Do you think that the participation of women voters in the upcoming election will be important? Will it be determinative, do you think?
I think when you ask questions like that, it is kind of hard to answer, because from my experience, and I've been doing this elections for 36 years, that it always seems to be important. It depends on the national issue, and it depends on the person who's running. And to go back to piggyback on what Dottie said, I think that we're cuddling too much in terms of making young people seem that they're not aware and that they don't know what's going on. It is my experience, and the Board of Elections here, we go into the schools when we were able to sign up 17-year-old, and now with the new law, 16-year-old, to pre-register. Our computer system is as such that the minute that their birthday come and they turn 18, it automatically kicks in and they receive a card telling them that they're registered. The large participation of young people come when it's an issue they relate to, such as when Bernie Sanders was offering free tuition. If you remember, and I was down at the convention in Philadelphia, you had a lot of young people participating because they thought they were going to get free tuition. As far as in school, I heard you ask that question. It depends with the young people. There are a lot of absentee ballot that goes to different schools. You normally are registered where you live. A lot of young folks at a certain point change their registration to the state they're going to school.
Mm-hmm.
In the department, they change their registration so they could get in-state rates from being out of state. So I think the young folks are very much in tune, more than you would know. We get, as Dottie said, the requests here all the time for their voter registration card.
But if I understand you, you're saying they get involved when there's one issue that pulls them in, as opposed to the issue of citizenship and civic duty and the right to vote.
That's something you mature into. And you can see that across the board in terms of, you let there be a candidate that's pro-right to life, and you will see a large turnout of women voters on pro-choice. So it depends on the issue, such as you have the issue now is on, and you could break it down to the wear mask, don't wear mask, to the vaccination, etc. Then you get voters. Voters normally jump in when there are issues that basically affect them, going back to black voters in '64, when it was the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act.
Right.
You know, so it varies. You can't just blanket it in terms of, but you still have that large numbers, or you wouldn't have turnouts the way it is of those who know once they get active that it's their civic duty. And they
Right.
will come to vote. We do voter history. Every time you vote, we chart that you voted in this election. And there's a large number of the same folks voting in the voter history in the same, and that's why they're called prime voters. That candidates come in and want a list of all the prime voters so that they could send literature to.
Can
Okay,
I ask a follow-up question actually really quick?
Sure, go for
Okay,
it.
for that, I'm just curious because you talked about the initiatives you have about registering students, young people to vote, and I think that's fantastic, especially being in the school. My question is, and maybe you don't have the numbers, are those young people actually voting?
Well, we could track that. I don't have it on hand, but we could track that because that goes back to the voter credit. We can go in the system, get the age and see in terms by individual names and see how many elections they voted in. We do the same with women voters.
I think that's the important number here. I mean,
Right.
I think that we get a lot of students and young people who register to vote, and then the day comes and they feel they don't feel enough, I don't know, they don't have enough will to participate, or they feel they aren't heard, all of these things. And so
it's hard to agree with that. As I said, all depends, you in terms of what issue affect them. It all depends. Yeah. And what election, such as this election, young people are very much involved in. And Dottie is the Republican, I'm the Democrat, but we both know that this election, for one reason or another, young people are such involved in. We saw it from the primary, Well,
it's a divisive election. I'd just be curious numbers, not just in presidential elections, but obviously in local elections where we do see a lower voter turnout across the board in non-presidential years. But I would wonder.
Local elections are turned to be divisive elections also.
Oh, I know.
You must remember. So that's why we see it. Oh, and local election, as Tip O'Neill said, all politics is local, So local election, but a large part depends on those who are running for office and how they campaign. You got to energize the voters. You have to offer something. Folks has to know who they're coming out for. And that's why it turns, and in case in point, the school board election has turned to be where it's the old against the young, if I could put it that way, because the young folks want activities in the school. The budget, every time there's an increase of budget, that means you could keep the band going, the football team going, the basketball team going. If you ever notice, when the budget goes down, those who want a certain amount of dollars in the budget always say, okay, we got to cut. Where does the first place they start cutting? Is the program that the young people are more likely to want to do. They start cutting sports. And then as they start cutting, then you ask for another election, because now it's like twice, and then you'll see the increase from one election to the other, where they say, okay, we're going to vote to pass this budget so you won't cut football. So it all goes in.
Let me ask you all about sort of a young person's, the world in which young people live, and that's social media. Does that have an influence, do you think, on their propensity to vote? And in particular, just to bring it back to young women's propensity to vote?
Well, it has an impact because, as you know, young people pay attention to social media a lot than folks around my age and your age. And so therefore there's a lot of campaigning being done on social media. A lot of campaigning and a lot of exchange of in favor or not in favor. A lot of criticism are done on social media by social. So yeah, that has a large impact. And a lot of young folks are getting jobs working on campaign to track and watch the social media.
We have another question, which I'll put to either Maureen or Dana. Dana, I'll start with you. What is currently being done about voter turnout on the Mercy campus for November, especially with the cogent comments on barriers that you, Dana, pointed out?
Well, we had this event, which I believe not many students signed up for. I'm not sure if there's that many here right now. But
it wasn't as much as we had hoped, right?
Yeah, but if I'm being honest, I think that we can do more. One thing that would help is that we have class on election day. Like, it would be nice if classes were canceled so that it would be actually easier for people to go to the polls, but we don't have that. So as far as I know, I have these conversations with my students about voting and everything, but I don't really see much going on Mercy's campus. It's also a little bit difficult now because of COVID and not everyone's here on campus, but I do think that's something that in general we could do more of.
Maureen, you agree?
I agree with Dana. I know that 4 years ago, my history club, we did this huge, when we used the Rock the Vote, I saw that going on in the chat. Rock the Vote is still around. And we used them to register about 75 students to vote in a 2-hour event, which was great. And it was outside, it was really great. But we can't really do that now. And actually, I just got the information from Rock the Vote recently that they've moved it all digital. And so I'm trying to get our history club to be kind of initiatives on social media and so forth to use this to help students, promote the right to vote. Unfortunately, I'm not getting students interested in helping to promote that. And I don't know what the deal is this year. And I think maybe there's the fatigue, right, around all this stuff with COVID and trying to balance and trying to figure out what's happening. So it's really disconcerting. But I think we could do a better job at Mercy College as a whole by promoting events that are geared towards students. COVID is putting some dampers on things, but I think we could do a better job of it.
I'm very surprised that classes are not canceled on election day. I mean, across the state, election day, the schools are closed.
Not the colleges.
But not the college. I'm very surprised so bad.
Yeah.
Well, we can take that up with powers that be.
Yeah, but how do you, so I'm surprised because it seemed like that would be your part in encouraging young people to vote, or not just vote. Here's a major issue, because both Dottie and I, from Republican and Democrat, we have recruited from time to time, and we try to recruit young people to work as poll inspectors.
Yes.
So if your class would cancel that day, they could have made as much or pick up as much as $350 a day to work as a poll inspector.
I do have students who do that. And I allow them to miss class to be a poll inspector.
We have recruited. That's why I say I'm surprised you can't really talk about student participation and the lack of student participation without having something to encourage them to participate.
Dottie, I want to bring you into this again. Where can you go if you don't feel like you know enough? Where can you go to find out about all the candidates' views on issues, whether they are women's issues or any garden variety issues? Where can you go for that?
The League of Women Voters offers a lot of information on all of the candidates and their issues. And I guess they could go to the headquarters of each party and see if they have anything there.
So we played a little piece of video from Mary Jane Reddington at the top of this. She, of course, graduated from the College of New Rochelle in 1945, and her first vote that she cast was, if I remember that correctly, 1944. We also spoke with her daughter, Muffy Reddington, who also graduated from the College of New Rochelle in 1976 and brings sort of a younger perspective to all of us. So let's hear what Muffy had to say.
My story about voting is the fact that I was 18 years old in 1972. I was a freshman at the College of New Rochelle, and this was the first time that 18-year-olds could vote. The 26th Amendment was passed to grant voting to 18-year-olds. And from what I understand, the 26th Amendment passed in a record number of days because it was so important to grant the vote to 18-year-olds. And as a result of that, I hold my right to vote as a very important civic duty because of the fact that I was in that first class, so to speak. And I haven't missed a vote in all those years. And I vote not only every 4 years during the, the federal presidential elections, but I vote locally. I voted locally to make sure my mother got voted into office when I was voting for the Board of Education. But it's important to vote at every single level and every single year.
Thank you for that. Yes, it is. Once again, mother and daughter, it's important to vote. And yes, Marie Turley, you may chime in from wherever you are. Unmute yourself and whatever you'd like to add to this, go for it.
So first of all, I'm so honored to be here because my mom was in the class of 45 with Mary Jane. So it's an honor to be here today. And my sister can't be here. She's an attorney in New York, but she was class of 73. So we're a legacy team. But the thing that's so complicated about talking about voting in a venue like this is that it's state by state. So when you were talking about how do you find out, go to your Secretary of State's website.
Oh.
Particularly right now with the sort of complex conversation between our president and the laws that you can't vote twice. It's a felony. So people can track their absentee ballots through many states on the Secretary of State's website. So if you apply to vote in this period of virus on using an absentee ballot or whatever language your state uses, most secretaries of state in progressive states are tracking it. And again, I'm speaking for Massachusetts, but nationally, there's great efforts going on to help people understand who's on the ballot, what the issues are, what the parties are, what the designation means about how you choose to vote, whether you vote absentee, you vote early voting, etc. So again, your Secretary of State and your Attorney General's offices are real, as well as elections. And I never, never, never want to bypass the incredible work that the team that's on this call do in day-to-day election work, because we rely on it in Boston. So I'm on this call because I care about the issue and because it was so lovely to be on with Mary Jane's family. And Eileen, thank you for keeping the CNR gang in the mix. It's an amazing work that you guys are doing. And Mercy, thank you for making us feel so welcome. But I'm a Democratic State Committee woman. I've worked backstage at the last 5 conventions. I was an elector for the woman who won the popular vote. So I really think that helping people understand the complexities of this great opportunity we have to vote right now is critical. So your Attorney General, your Secretary of State, your amazing folks in your local election departments are working overtime. Our postal people are working overtime. We need to support those vehicles and help people understand that, like hanging chads, this may not be decided on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November, but it's critical to educate people about how this can go forward. I'm going to stop. If anybody wants to reach me, poor Eileen knows how to do that. And I'm happy to. I don't want to monopolize it. It's just a state by state. It's complex, but it's also very easy to understand. We don't have to make it hard.
Right. Christina, did you want to jump in here?
I just want to clarify because I checked before I started this research. New York State Secretary of State does not deal with the elections. In California, it's a huge, wonderful. I think the Board of Elections is the place to check whether you're registered, how to register, and vote. And also the league has, and since Dottie gave me the entree, the league has a site called Vote 411. And they have a list of the candidates, how to register. You can register online there. Unfortunately, I think it's a little early in the process because they do send out questions to every candidate that's running, local up to the president, and most have not returned. And then there will be a follow-up, but that process is too early to check out 411, vote 411. But as we get closer, in October, mid-October, be a great resource to do that because, as you know, with COVID, we won't be doing candidates meetings and forums and anything like that. Some have taped them, but I think most of it, that's not going to happen this year.
Dana, do you or Maureen have thoughts about where women can go to acquaint themselves with the issues that they care about?
Yeah, I mean, I always have used the League of Women Voters website. I've always done that. And I do like that your local newspapers usually have something in the weeks running up to the election that tell you what the candidates stand for and all the propositions, right? The proposals, which are sometimes so hard to understand because if you vote no, you mean yes and vice versa. So it's really good to become educated about those before you go. I also encourage people to, especially young people, to look up what a ballot looks like before they actually go to vote. If they're going to vote in person, if they're getting it in mail, they can look at it ahead of time and understand what they're looking at, because I think that's very important, understanding how to vote. It can be confusing for young people at times, even though the ballot isn't that confusing. It's just the whole process can be intimidating.
Right.
If I can jump in here, because
yes, go ahead, Reginald. Go ahead.
It's very important. You have to tell folks to check with their state, particularly with their county. Here in New York State, there are 62 counties in the state. There's 2 commissioners for each county, Democrat and Republican. They actually run the election. New York has also a separate board of elections for the state. Nothing is connected to the Secretary of State or to the Attorney General. The Attorney General becomes the law enforcement office for the local board of elections. Then you have to separate in getting information from the Board of Elections or information that the Board of Elections do not campaign for a candidate, so they won't have issues on their website. That, you're correct, in the League of Women Voters. Because the major thing, even as you're talking about registering to vote or getting people to register to vote, the last day in New York State, the deadline to register to vote by mail or in person is October 9th, so that you can get it into the polling sites. The last day to mail in an application request for an application ballot is October 27th. These are the important things that has to go out there, not to mix them all together, because then you won't get really the information. The day, no election is settled the day after the election.
Mm-hmm. Right.
In New York State, we have a 7-day count for absentee ballots to come in. And those absentee ballot has to be postmarked on election day. So if they postmark on election day, which is November 3rd, and they come in 7 days after that, they're good to be open.
They can be postmarked on or before, right?
Yeah, on or before.
Yeah.
But I'm using the election day because that was a new executive order. And the normal time to open that would be 7 days after the election, but in an executive order, it stretches to 10 days after the election. So what you get on election night is really an unofficial count by what comes off of the machine. If it's close, you still got ballots coming in. If the margin is really big, that's when a winner is called. And this is where the media confuses people, because sometimes they call a winner too soon.
Right.
And so folks are thinking that it's all settled. We have until December 15th to certify elections. That means that you close it out. So you, as you can see, the span of time runs from November 3rd to December 15th.
I think we would all pass out if it went to then, but yes, I guess that's the law. I want to get a question in from Elizabeth West, which goes back to women's voting rights. Are there still particular blocks of women that still struggle with voting numbers? And if so, does it link back to the issues presented in the election? And how do we encourage women of all ethnicities and backgrounds to vote on a regular basis?
So my response to the second part of that question, I think that sometimes we tend to live in this echo chamber where we only interact with people who kind of look and act and think like us. Honestly, I think that one way to encourage more women to vote would be to have conversations with other types of women, like not just people who look and think and act like you, but to also like branch out and go to where they are. So I think that a lot of it is that sometimes women and even people in general don't feel as if the candidates speak to them, don't feel as if the candidates really care about issues that are particular to them. So I think going to them and having conversations with, again, people who might not like look and think and act like us, it's crucial as well. I'm thinking like events like this are great, even though like an event like this, people who already care about voting and who think it's important are going to join an event like this. But going back to that conversation that we were having earlier about ways in which colleges and even Mercy could do more, we could go to students, go to them and talk with them about voting, help them make the process transparency, help them register, know where their polling place is and all of that. So I would say bring it to them, essentially.
I just add to the groups to answer that question that I feel are still struggling. I would say like Native American women definitely are still having really big difficulties. And I'd speak for the New York area, I would say Latina. I mean, I think that's still a really big issue, especially for the people who live in the New York and tri-state area, is this idea that Latina women are not voting. And they're not voting for a myriad of reasons, mainly due to family commitments, working, all of these things like that. And those are groups that really need to be, to have more access to the right to vote. I think AOC's election a couple years ago really did a lot for showing an young Latina woman who, no matter what your party is, showing that somebody can be elected and that she hears people or that she's representing them. And I think that's done a lot to encourage women in the Latina community, but I still think there's work that needs to be done.
We only have a couple minutes and I want to let you share any final thoughts you have. Christina, let me just start with you and let me bring it back again to, this was a celebratory moment, and as we marked the 100th anniversary of women getting the right to vote. When you think about then and you think about now, what are any final thoughts you have on this subject?
Well, I think it's not directly to your point, but I think we need to have better access to voting, not just one day. Out in California, it's a whole different world out here. We have early voting. You can vote. You don't even have to be at your polling place to vote. We have boxes that you can deposit your mail. So, people work. We talk about a certain segment. They work, they go to school. They don't have time to stand on a line to vote. So we have to make it easier, not make it a penalty or a hardship to vote. We just need to make it more accessible to people of all types, not just the people who have time to take off from work or don't work or retired. So I think that's my other little point is.
Isn't that fabulous? I saw one of those the other day. That is
my
great.
Final words. So.
Yes, that is a good final word. Dana, what about you?
I would say my final closing word would be to talk with people about voting. So I know that with COVID, we can't really do that in person, but there's even online events, things like that. Definitely just have these conversations about voting. I think that one thing would be really helpful would be to also ask people what they're interested in or what's something that they're dissatisfied with, maybe a particular issue, and then talk through it with them. These are conversations that I have with my students, and it gets them interested about issues and interested in candidates who even support some of the viewpoints that they have or some of the issues that they want to address. So I would just say talk about voting and talk about it often and talk about it why, because you never know what your words will say and you never know who you're going to impact. So definitely just speak about it.
Great advice. Maureen?
I would say that women are powerful, and if we are able to unite together to, not just voting for our specific parties, but to vote and to have our issues heard, no matter what side of the issue you're on, I think we could do a lot. So I guess my advice is, as a woman, I think that we need to be more active in the political realm. We need to be able to gain not just women, but women of color into politics and be voting them in. And we need to stop being our own worst enemy. Women go for the throat, and we need to stop that and start supporting each other more. And I think that, to me, is the most important thing, about women voting.
Amen to that. Okay, let me give the last final thoughts to the two people who will be the busiest people on the block over the next couple months, Reginald and Dottie. Any final thoughts from either of you as we
Yes. My
celebrate
final
women
thought-
getting the right to vote and discuss getting more women to vote?
Well, again, as election commissioner, we're to provide areas for safe voting and to make sure we encourage. And by that, in New York State, in Westchester County, we have early voting starting the 24th of October for 9 days. It ends the day before election. For 9 days, you could vote. Poll sites are open up in selected area on Saturdays and Sunday
Good, good.
at certain times. So, when I heard the comment about now it's more convenient to vote, whether you work that, because you could come out for 9 days and vote. So, and vote by absentee. We've mailed application to some 500,000, almost 600,000 registered voters, 599,000 active registered voters receive an application to request an absentee ballot. So we have made it easier. The state has made it easier in New York State to vote. That should encourage everyone, young, old, women, and men.
Dottie, any final thoughts from you?
I see every year more women are coming out to vote and more women are getting involved. So I think that's a plus to everything going on. And I see it, just getting better each year.
Well, I hope that's true. I'm glad you see that. I want to thank everybody. We're a couple minutes over our time, but Maureen, Dana, Christina, Reginald, Dottie,
Thank you.
everyone who participated in this, Mary Jane, Muffy, thank you all. Like I said, we will put this up so you can share it. A lot of good points here about reaching out to young people, which I think we at Mercy College would be well advised to take into account. And I'm just going to leave you with one final thought from a CNR person who is now a Mercy person. We are all mothers, daughters, and sisters to one another in this effort. Show that you care. Thank you, Eileen, for that. And I'll say goodbye to everyone. And thank you so, so much for participating in this. It was great.
Thank you.
Thank you.